in Washington. And Bob Carr, let me start with you. I mean, Christopher Hitchens' view of what's possible and what's likely with this administration obviously differs a lot from yours.
I think it's a wonderful dose of realism. There's nothing he said that I disagree with. And Christopher, I greatly admire your book on God. Congratulations. But I think we are entitled on the very night of the election to just pause for 1 minute and say America has elected an African American as its president. In view of American history, right back to 1619 and the arrival of the first African slaves, even before the Mayflower, in view of the Civil War, in view of the 15th Amendment, in view of 100 years of segregation, in view of Martin Luther King, we are entitled to
the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court.
Yes, a great decision out of the Supreme Court.
Why leave that out?
Yeah. Well, it should be there. Brown versus Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Education.
1954,
yes.
And even Southern justices listening to the argument of the black advocate, Thurgood Marshall, and saying schools in South Carolina will be desegregated. In view of all of this, this is a wonderful and poignant moment. We can pause on it just for a minute. And then consider the great challenges facing this administration.
All that had already happened. These are the conditions under which Obama was elected. They're not the conditions that he creates by being elected. Excuse me. It's just confusion in your lovely, warm heart, sir, between post hoc and propter hoc. All those victories had already occurred. This isn't a victory that makes those things happen. It's a victory made possible by those things.
Christopher, a lot of us feel a fondness for America.
Racist, well, I just want you to know, I want to know from you, what racist obstacle is he promising to break down?
Well, Christopher, I'm going to leave that rhetorical point in the air because the first obstacle he broke down was becoming President of the United States, and that is undeniable because that is going to happen. Robert Mann.
Look, in answer to Christopher, cynicism is easy, and it's not a new thing to say the subprime crisis is a crisis or that Afghanistan is a problem and that he faces, because of the mess of the people in part Christopher backed, he faces an enormous challenge. I have never, in following politics for a long time, perhaps as long as Christopher, I have never come a politician who has written a book as delicate as Dreams from My Father. Never. I've also never heard a speech of greater intellectual depth than the one he delivered when Reverend Wright was putting him under the hammer. I also think that he can see through the kind of problems that the United States has. He knows about climate change. He knows about the obscenity of the health system. What he'll be able to do, God only knows. But if ever there's a night not to be cynical, or not for realism even to take over, in my view, and it's not a view of someone who is a kind of dreamer, I'm not. I have never encountered a politician in following politics for almost 50 years who has the depth or the intellectual agility or the judgment that I think he's shown in the astonishing thing of someone of his background to get to the head of Harvard Law and now to get to the presidency. I'll back that strongly.
All right, let me bring Michael Duffy into this conversation before Christopher Hitchens. Michael Duffy, is there going to be a serious problem with meeting expectations? You came to this earlier in the discussion. When we think about what Christopher said earlier, it's true to say that many of the people in his transition team are very conservative, traditional type of politicians. There's nothing especially radical about his transitional team, is there?
I think there was a point in the last couple of weeks where they saw a wave coming in the vote that was going to be probably actually more mandate than they wanted, more than they had ever bargained for, more than they could ever manage the expectations of. And as I said earlier, I think they may have caught a small break in that regard tonight because the Democrats generally underperformed expectations, at least so far, on the House and Senate side. And I think his ability to keep his coalition together now that it's much larger than it has been for any Democrat since apparently 1964 is a challenge. And we can all ready ourselves, I suppose, for stories about liberal disappointment. I don't think we're going to have to wait to Christmas to see them either. I think it'll be much sooner. On the point of racial breakthroughs, it was an interesting question that Christopher posed, but if I ever get home tonight, You know, I will tuck in 3 children, or at least they'll already be asleep. And it's one thing to do that when your kids are white, but I wonder whether you might tuck in your children if they were black in a slightly different manner or mode, or with slightly different expectations tonight than you did last night. And I think that affects all of us, but I think it particularly affects African Americans and probably people of color all over the world in a way different than it does for people like me. And I don't know that you can measure that in terms of position papers or court cases or the progress that would result and the aspirations that might be given life as a result of what took place today. But I suspect that there's a chemical quality to that change that we probably can't measure on any grid.
Christopher Hitchens, that was eloquently put, and so I'm wondering whether you are feeling perhaps you should put aside a certain degree of your journalistic cynicism, at least briefly.
I honestly would rather call it realism if you don't terribly mind. I mean, first, one of your guests, I'm sorry I can't see them, so I hope I don't identify the wrong one. I'll just say one of your guests. By mentioning the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, points out, perhaps inadvertently, that actually the most racist demagogue in the entire campaign, and anyone can look up his speeches, and anyone can find out that he's a fan of another racist crackpot cult leader, Louis Farrakhan, someone who really has done a great deal to poison race relations, if you want to call them that in the United States, is the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. The pastor, the religious guidance person of the man who's just been elected president, who was only disowned when he became inconvenient to the aspirations of the candidate. I'm sorry I can't get as moist and trusting as everyone else apparently can about this. I think if race matters, if there is indeed such a thing as race, such a category, then it matters all the time or not at all. And you can't just say, well, my daughter, as a matter of fact, has been canvassing for Senator Obama in the depths of Virginia. And no doubt herself tucked up feeling that justice has been done in some way. But if I was to have to tell her, well, how is that? How is that proved? How is that established by this vote? I'm sorry if I can't come up with anything glib or, as you would say, idealistic.
Bob Carr.
Well, and the rest of the world remains exactly as rough as it was yesterday. And I think any grown-up person is going to have to face that sooner rather than later. You just proposed, why don't we take both of your guests actually in Australia proposed, let's take a night off from that. Let's just pretend that's not true. Surely, let's have an evening of celebration. Actually, I didn't sit up this long to say, let's all celebrate. It's not what I came into journalism to do. I came to ask questions and to listen to the answers, and to make the answers tougher if I got a soft or soggy answer, such as, let's all be united, let's have no red and blue states, let's all be Americans.
All right,
I'm sorry.
Christopher, no.
That's mush.
Completely understood, and we'll get Bob Carr to respond.
Yeah, 45 years ago, a black American in one of the southern states would have been threatened with violence for going to register to vote. Threatened with violence for going there to put his or her name on the electoral roll, and they were turned away.
Who doesn't know that?
Tonight,
Who doesn't know that?
Tonight, a black American has been elected President of the United States. Yes, I do feel more fond of America now than I did at any time when George Bush was President.
Robert Mann,
if John McCain had been elected, it'd be just as easy to vote as a black person in Florida or Alabama or Mississippi.
That's not remotely the point I'm making.
Or do you think the corollary doesn't? Or do you think it wasn't the point you're making? Does the corollary to your point hold?
Okay, I'm afraid Chris, I'm going to have to cut you off because we've been joined by our Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, and we're going to have to let all of you go from this discussion for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. And for a reaction to the result, we are joined by Stephen Smith. He's in our Perth studio, and you heard Barack Obama's acceptance speech, Stephen Smith. So I'm wondering, were you moved by it?
Well, I do think it's a day and a night of great historical significance. I mean, we have, for the first occasion, an African-American who's been elected as President of the United States. Now, any new administration, any new government, whatever nation of the world, a change of government, a new government, brings with it chance of fresh application to long-standing or difficult problems. But this is a change which is deeply significant, deeply historical, and I think it does bring a significant opportunity for the new administration to deal with current and ongoing difficult international issues with, if you like, almost a fresh start and the chance of making progress where in the past we haven't seen much progress being made. Now,
indeed.
that's
So,
not
well,
in any way
let me just
to-
interrupt you there. In what areas specifically do you think it's going to be easier to deal with this administration than the previous one?
Well, firstly, I'm not going to say anything which reflects upon the current US administration.
I think you just
people
did.
need to well, no, I think people need to understand that the Australian government has been working very positively and very constructively with the current Bush administration, and we'll do that until the 20th of January. That's very important. There's no caretaker role here. There's a transitional phase which will now gear up, as it always does in the United States political approach. But we've been working productively and constructively with the current administration. Nothing
just
that I
underline
have
for us.
said
Just
to-
underline for us then with the next administration where you see the big advances, and will it be, for example, in the area of climate change?
Well, let me just deal very quickly with a couple of things that we will impress upon the new administration. Firstly, the ongoing importance of the alliance, which transcends Labor or Liberal governments here and Republic or Democrat administrations there. Secondly, we will say to the new administration that the ongoing active engagement of the United States in the Asia-Pacific is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential because in this century, as we see economic and political and strategic influence move to our part of the world, an ongoing active engagement by the United States is absolutely essential. Then there are the array of challenges which the international community faces, where we will want the new administration actively engaged and where we will want to be working closely with them. Climate change is one of them. The United States' relationship with China is another. I think there's a prospect, for example, given the President-elect's background, that the United States may, for example, have more of an engagement with Indonesia, which would of itself be a good thing. And then we have some difficult peace and security issues. Afghanistan, where both the candidates, President-elect Obama and Senator McCain, indicated an enhanced desire for an enhanced commitment, not just in military terms, but also in civil capacity terms and in political settlement terms in Afghanistan, the difficult problem of Pakistan, and then an issue that I think may well end up being one of the most significant difficulties the international community has this time next year, which is Iran's nuclear program, let alone, for example, the ongoing difficulty with the North Korean nuclear program. So there are plenty of challenges which we want to be working closely with the new administration with. But the point I make is not a reflection on the past or on the current administration. This is a deeply historic and significant change. That of itself opens up new prospects and new possibilities in my view.
Stephen Smith, thanks for joining us, albeit briefly at the end of the show. We have to cross back now to Chicago and to our ABC correspondent Mark Simkin, who's still at Grant Park for where he's been for the massive Barack Obama rally, which is now dissipated. But while it's quieter in Chicago, I understand there have been celebrations in other parts of the country.
Yes, Tony. Spontaneous celebrations on the streets, for example, of Washington, D.C. Huge numbers of people marching through the streets, gathering outside some of the key institutions, celebrating this historic occasion. And you can't look at those scenes and not be reminded of similar scenes several decades ago when Martin Luther King rallied the faithful in the streets of Washington, D.C. and declared, "I have a dream." And for so many of these people today, that dream has been realised.
Mark, if you had to pick one factor that was key to this victory, what would it be?
Well, the exit polls suggest that 6 out of 10 people identified the economy as the key factor in this election. Not just the fact that the Republican brand was damaged by the economic crisis. John McCain's response was not great, but also the ground game. There were so many factors of this very sophisticated and clever Obama campaign that influenced the result.
OK, we'll have to leave you there, Mark. We're out of time. We've come up to the next program that's coming on the ABC. We thank you very much for joining us. That is the end of our special election coverage.
Coming up in the news tonight, the celebrations, commiserations and the road ahead after US voters choose their first African-American president. And can Adelaide United make soccer history in Japan?
At 7:30, a moment in history as Barack Obama becomes America's first black president. Tonight, reaction to this remarkable victory as we cross to the US to assess what it means for America and the world. Join us, 7:30.
From pop god
Michael Jackson has the mind of a genius
to rock bottom.
This is definitely not Neverland.
Michael Jackson's long road from the top.
I have been forced to submit to a humiliating examination.
The facts.
He was methodically creating a bizarre character.
The fiction.
Wait a minute, man. Cut the camera off.
Michael Jackson, What Really Happened, 8:30 tonight on ABC2.
I would like the world to be slower, I admit that, but the sheer complexity of the organism of the modern community that we live in, I think it's a natural wonder.